Welcome to the k.r.f Films Entertainment channel. The 3 laws of the lighthouse are finally broken after the medicine collection mission by Mark. According to the life formula, milk in a safe by hunt is even if he had no therapeutic value is the master of the lighthouse. He has to lead by example, otherwise the laws are meaningless. So if Mark hadn't been assassinated by inferior 4068, it would have been the best time to abolish the laws, but spinal centipede's parasitism makes Mark, who should have been dead, devour its cells, instead becoming a monster. Walking out of the incinerator, more quickly fainted and fell to the ground. Kerry, who was in charge of biological research, immediately takes him to the laboratory. To their surprise, Mark not only recognizes himself but even has mood swings. Looking at the group photo of hunters, he might have awakened his memories while he is caught up in the moment. The photo was replaced with Ramping performing a breeding task. Upon seeing this, Mark burst out in anger. After venting, he seems a little scared and slowly retreat into the darkness. To bound again. Through analysis, Mark still retains some of his memories and emotions but is unable to speak and control his emotions. The gym medic analysis reveals that his body has a cross-species genetic mutation, which means he is no longer human. Carrie cannot believe that Mark could survive after undergoing such a drastic mutation. Then she immediately retrieves his genes before mutation for comparison, only to be prompted with no access rights. At the moment, 3 members of the city defense break into the lab claiming that they will conduct tolerance experiments. It's on Mark using different weapons. Although the researchers are worried that Mark could be killed, they are more afraid of disobeying orders except to record data. The results show that Mark's body is now much tougher than the ancient large reptiles. His cells also have a cell wall-like structure and his hemoglobin count is far above normal. And even more implausible fact is that genetic testing of the cells left over from his surgery reveals that he is only 94.6% genetically identical to a normal human. So Mark was not human before he mutated. At the beginning of the promulgation of the 3 laws, everyone did genetic testing. Carrie wonders why no one knows about such a special gene. Suddenly Mark's vital signs begin to converge to the critical value of the death. He appears to be in a comatose state after being shot wildly, but just as the man was venting his personal emotions, Mark's bodily functions recover rapidly. While seeing the 3 slaughtered by Mark, Carrie finally understands why he could recover so quickly after the injury. Maybe that's why Morgan appointed Mark as the master of the lighthouse, because he already knew that Mark and the survivors on the ground are not human. Charles comes to see his father as soon as is sent into the lab. Now that he has turned into a monster, Charles implies that he is the only one who can act as the master. It turns out that in a mission all the hunters were retreating when a giant ugly extremist saw and chose young Charles just as it was about to eat him. With its mouth wide open, a mysterious human wearing a cloak drove away the extremist Soren group. To his amazement, this human's face was a starry sky. Since then, he thought that only he could save mankind since he was saved by God. That's why he established the Light and Shadow Society and worshipped the Lord of Light and Shadow. Now things have come to a head. Morgan has no choice but to expose the truth to him. They arrive at the lighthouse's energy and computing center, which contains a super brain closed system. This system existed before the emergence of Mana Agia, but now it no longer works properly. It can simultaneously observe the position and momentum of microscopic particles, which means it has the ability to predict the future. So by knowing the time of the disaster in advance, the lighthouse, which was originally a prison in the sky, becomes the last refuge of humanity. After that, the survivors try to use this brain to find a way to clear the Mana Echo. Logical, but the answers it gives are unintelligible symbols and formulas except for one coordinate that can be deciphered. The first generation master rushed there but found a baby who was exactly Mark. Morgan believes that by training Mark to be a strong hunter, he will lead the lighthouse to defeat the Mana Ecological, but it isn't until Mark's surgery that Morgan really realizes he may be the ecological link between humans and man. Hearing all of this, Charles cannot believe that such a monster that can be beaten to a pulp with weapons is the hope of humans. After the conversation, Charles begins to call himself the acting master, but Morgan never appears again. He begins to deploy his own subordinates in various departments and attempts to replace the trusted people of Morgan on the training field. Everyone passes the buck for what happened to Mo. They are worried that Mark will die due to the research, but they are more afraid to go to save him. Understanding their standpoint, Rending decides to beg Charles to let him go. In her mind, he is already the master of the lighthouse. There is no need to persecute them anymore. Sure enough, Charles agrees to her request, but the lighthouse has to hold a ceremony for Mark, his dignity and life. Only 1 hour them can be chosen. In fact, this is another plot of Charles. He comes to visit inferior 1225's husband Luke, knowing that his heart came from an inferior. Luke is so appreciative, but he is told that the inferior is 1225 and that has sent her to the superior medical area. Personally, he looks at the intimate photo of him and his wife sad and ng. Gary, but what Charles doesn't tell him is that inferior 1225 volunteered to donate her heart, so now Luke will believe that it was Mark who killed his wife. The next day, all the people of the lighthouse gather to observe the ceremony. As the commander of hunters, Mark has accumulated a lot of fame. Carrie, like Morgan, believes Mark is the only possibility of saving the lighthouse, almost as one can't bear the thought of Mark and Rending being exiled. At this moment, Luke rushes out pretending to be grateful but trying to assassinate Mark. Lifting his bogger, he finds that Mark has turned into a monster which is only known by some superiors. All inferior are instantly shocked in their attitudes. Reverse, seeing Mark locked up, Luke recklessly abuses and wrongfully accuses him, a member of the congregation, also a bet that he was punished by the Lord of Light and Shadow. If they don't burn him, they themselves will suffer the wrath. In the confusion, all people hate Mark even more and want to execute him immediately. Soon Luke leads the inferior to attack Mark and Rending, but a roar of Mark makes standing people around retreat, causing the fence to collapse. Many inferior fall off the lighthouse, attracting a very large number of extremists. And at this time, the survivors on the ground who saved Mark and the other hunters in the ecological intensive area are seeing the falling inferiors. Now they have received orders from Master Like to pick up Mark. From their conversation, the extreme his own evolves by absorbing the life force. Once they can fly, the lighthouse will no longer be safe, and the most important fact is that the fundamental reason for attracting the extremists is actually emotions. It turns out that at the remains of the R-49 spaceship, Ramping had a crush on Mark, and at the remains of the Nirvana biotechnology company, two superiors were speaking loving words to each other in front of the evil monster. It was the emotions that attracted the extremists to attack. So it is the three laws that make the law. White House people heartless and thus avoid extremists, but they have never expected that the balance is broken by Mark in the lighthouse. The inferior years are more discontented and want to kill him. Just as Rending is about to lose his grip on Luke's knife, the deacon blows his head off to keep order. She thinks Charles would stop the riot, but he reneged on his promise. He gives the gesture of killing without mercy and the people cheer. At once, Ranbeen can only see his Mark is burned at the stake as the fire begins to consume his life. Mark never thinks he will experience the same fate as his sister during the execution. However, Charles does not have a pleasant look but instead stares intently as if expecting something. It turns out that he was in the computing center, and the last words Morgan gave him with it, maybe when Mark broke the last boundary he would be the real I hope for humanity. So Charles is testing what Mark's last boundary would be. At the critical moment, Mark's comrades suddenly appear and save him. They decide to betray the lighthouse at all costs to save him and leave the lighthouse to get. Charles is about to take control of the situation when he is aimed at his head by a congregation disguised as Mark's comrade. All the congregations and the city defenders have to stop the attack. However, Charles calmly tells him that it is his plan for Mark to have his throat slashed. Hearing this, he looks to the inferior 4068 with a superior badge. Finally understand. During the reason when he prepares to broadcast the news over the radio, he is strangled by Charles, a subordinate who carried out the breeding tasked with Rending but failed. The situation is already bad. Charles admits to everyone that he arranged for Ramping to carry out the breeding task and that he also arranged for Mark's murder. Upon hearing these words, Mark and his comrades are both surprised and angry. Suddenly, his subordinates launch a surprise attack on them and seriously injure Mark, causing him to be on the verge of unconsciousness. In order to heal his wounds, his instinct to absorb human life force appears. Mark is about to absorb a nearby boy when Rendering swoops in and gently hugs him around his midriff. She supports Mark and expresses her wish to live on the ground with him in the old world. People who are in law love me, marry in front of everyone and live all together without ever separating, but loving each other becomes impossible in the doomsday world. Rambling seems to be embracing the original Mark, sad and grieving as she speaks, for life force flows involuntarily into Mark, who has lost consciousness because of survival instincts. His comrades try to stop it but to no avail. Rending knows his feet and no longer exists. Maybe it is not regretful for her to sacrifice herself to be a part of him. After she says I love you, Ramping is frozen and transformed into a statue in her final moments of life. Meanwhile, Mark heals all his wounds after absorbing all the life force, yet after regaining consciousness he just sees a petrified woman. Ranbeen Mark desires to reach out and touch her to express his sorrow and rage. Great, but a gunshot shatters ramping statue. Everyone including Mark and Charles is done by what they saw. His subordinate completely enrages Mark. His body Me Too scarlet pheromone that is exclusive to extremists or, and he finally understands that this last boundaries to transform Mark into the extremists or, and ever since Mark is announced as the successor of the master Charles USB and trying to assassinate him, but who would have believed that he would help Mark become the actual savior of humanity? Now he finally believes it just as he's waving his hand to command the hunters to capture Mark. His left arm is severed after saving the falling Charles. The hunters manipulating the heavy-duty metro begin to chase him. Mark retains some humanity knowing he cannot resist the weapon and hence must outs. He flees instead of battling because he plans to consume the mix energy and utilize its fighter power to destroy the lighthouse's energy pipes. At this moment Mark can run into with the White House. Well, running into a dead end purposefully wait by leaping fast to avoid it since behind him is a bunch of energy pipes. Sure enough, this attack causes a sequence of explosions and several alarms sounded in the control room. Even a series of measures cannot stop the lighthouse from tilting the and have it into the lighthouse are fleeing for their lives and things are strewn everywhere. Many people are locked outside and unable to enter the lighthouse for refuge and can only fall to the ground. The whole lighthouse suddenly turns into a hell on earth. The hunters chase Mark until they are no longer able to fly. Mark then begins to fight back using one of the lighthouse components as a hammer to kill all of them. Now the lighthouse is unbalanced, making it difficult for the hunters to chase Mark, so he chooses to find Charles, the culprit of all the tragedy. Soon all the guards surrounding Charles died and he is grabbed by Mark. Instead of being afraid, he tells Mark all the truth. It is the ongoing release of emotions that enables the life force to emanate a powerful smell, allowing extremists or and to follow humans. Therefore this is the true reason why Morgan implemented the 3 laws, and the reason why Morgan didn't reveal the truth to everyone is that humans will lose their last home if there is a traitor in this closed system. But now this traitor is exactly Mark. Before Morgan could reveal the truth to him, Mark is on the verge of destroying the entire lighthouse. Seeing his guilty expression, Charles proposes a cooperation strategy to discover the mysteries of mana ecological in comparison to the fate of the entire human race. There is no need to mourn the loss of a woman. Upon hearing this, Mark becomes infuriated and stabs Charles his right eye. At this moment a boy is shooting at Mark. He cannot understand why Mark, who has been protecting the lighthouse, has killed almost everyone. Mark seems to understand something, throwing him from the lighthouse, and he falls to the ground as well, but they both don't die. Charles is rescued by Inferior 4068 and falls on the lighthouse platform. Mark is also rescued by his old comrade and both of them fall to the ground. Fortunately neither of them died, but Mark leaves alone. Even though the lighthouse was badly damaged, it can still run in order to keep the lighthouse in balance. A backup propulsion unit is activated. Many broken inferior residential areas are thrown to the ground, causing many inferior to lose their homes. Because Charles is still alive, the lighthouse has to be in order as usual. Many of Mark's close comrades are imprisoned. The lighthouse also exiles a large number of old and sick people, including the superiors. Light and Shadow Society arranges a large number of breeding tasks for adult men and women to supplement the population. A superior refuses to breeding task and chooses to jump off the lighthouse with his lover and inferior. The doctor is imprisoned only to keep inferior 9033 alive for a few more days. Soon after 9033 died and the doctor eat the cookie she has given her while crying in the midst of the catastrophe ever. Yvonne is mourning the loss of family and friends, venting out a lot of emotions which are a great temptation for the extremists or and on the ground. So how will the lighthouse survive when they evolve to be able to fly? Perhaps only Mark, who has returned to the ground, can save the lighthouse. After falling to the ground, Mark loses his human consciousness. He seems to be summoned in some way involuntarily, walking towards a canyon which used to be a bustling city but is now occupied by mana ecological. Other is and also walk with him. Mark is apparently a new species as the others are unfamiliar with him and even hostile towards him. The flow of mana seduction becomes stronger in the distance and all the extremists owns war and approach. The survivors have been secretly observing their movements and their mission is to pick up Mark. According to Master Last Instruction B, turns out that their action is to give Flora and Mana their plundered life force. They have not been found since extremist aliens can only perceive human emotions and they know how to suppress them. Mark is the only new species in the extremists Oren group and is soon discovered by the boss. By her name is Bayer, could be the boss of a group of 5 people. each of whom possesses unique abilities to help them live in the doomsday world. As Mark approaches Flow Manor, its tentacles begin to absorb life force from his body. Suddenly Mark finally regains consciousness, pulling off the tentacles to resist Flowy Man as instructions, and other extremists roar and begin to attack him. Seeing that he still has humanity, survivors promptly launch a rescue miss. First C. Otto uses the device to control an extremist cell, and this man hits the shield to interrupt the transmission of life force, while the commands of man as Flower also halted. Sui Scene demolishes a canyon wall to block the entry of the outside extremist cell, and Boss Bai orders his partner to attack the soul core inside extremists, and which is the key to killing them. After a good fight, the nearby extremist Selens are all killed. However, Mark is also bitten and his blood activates the last morass. They pour through Mark's body, instantly enhancing his battle prowess while occupying his human consciousness. In seconds, he kills the extremist and C. Otto controlled while she sustained an injury. When Mark is about to kill the female archer, Suisi, Boss Bai intervenes in time to save her. Yojut Chin. Perhaps via the utilization of some techniques, his attack is effortlessly repelled by her from the conversation, for techniques will accelerate cellular aging, so she must fight quickly since the technique cannot be used frequently. Other partners sit next to each other drinking water. They are very confident in Boss Bai. She is so agile that Mark cannot touch her. After grasping Mark's spine, she uses a technique to pin him to the ground by plunging her sword directly into his palm. Then she takes out a mysterious jar inscribed with ancient words. This use is actually the Chinese medical term for fire coming. Attaching it to Mark's back, Boss Bai finally removes the last morass from his body. After a series of operations, Mark loses consciousness. As the last morass expelled from his body, he dreams that he and Bean get married. While they are kissing, it appears as if Mark is absorbing Ranting's life force. Why? The guests are blessing them. It appears as if the people want Mark to be executed. Beauty and cruelty are intertwined in his dreams. The dream is over. He awakens with a jolt only to see that he is locked in the home of Boss Bai. Now that he has regained his human consciousness, he begs the little girl to kill him. After hearing this, Boss Bai releases him. She can feel his remorse and explains that the weakness of extremist Soren is exactly the soul core. At that time, he saw Ko was severely injured and he would die if he did not absorb the human life force, so he is driven by survival instincts to absorb Rendering's life force. Despite this, Mo continues to implore her to kill him. Boss Bai could only reveal more of the facts to Mark. When the end arrived, all humans were dehumanized and willing to do everything to survive. Hungry parents would eat their kids, families would kill one another for a safe haven, lovers were abducted and sold as slaves, friends would also betray each other. There was no difference between humans and beasts, but had friends, comrades, and even a lover. What a luxury to have these. Although Mark has become a monster, there are still people who are willing to die for him. Rending was sacrificed for the one she loved, so if Mark still wants to die, then her sacrifice is meaningless. Living in the end times, breaking the rules of survival will only lead to tragedy. The wickedness of human nature will be enormously amplified by the harsh environment. Thus, it is impossible to force people to adapt to the rules. Only when manner ecological is completely eradicated can mankind be truly reborn. All survivors will be able to live freely on the ground with their loved ones. Since its birth, manner ecological has been trying to absorb the life force of all human beings. Recently, a vortex of scarlet pheromone has emerged which will breed even more horrible extremists, and one of its pathways connects to the manner ecological center. Only by entering there will humanity find a solution to fight manner ecological, but it is impossible for humans to enter. Only Mark, who is an extreme as Ellen, can enter. Boss Bai opens the door. This is another place where people live. At the lighthouse, emotions are a source of disaster, but here emotions are the source of power to stimulate potential. He is the only person who can enter the vortex to save humanity as long as he is willing. Boss Bai will grind him and instruct him on how to awaken the energy that is naturally concealed within the body. It's up to him to decide whether to accept or reject the mission. After hearing all this, he is finally convinced by her and shows a determined expression. At the same time, the super brain close system, which has stopped working for many years, suddenly responds. Perhaps history is finally moving in the right direction. Charles appoints Superior 4068 as the new commander of the hunt, as he knows that Mark is the hope of the lighthouse. So the first mission given to 4068 is to bring Mark back to the lighthouse. At this moment, he is looking at the black armor. Is this the Abyss Walker program? Let's wait for the second season of The Incarnation. Thanks for watching. This is all the episodes of the first season of The Incarnation. If you are interested in this anime, you can watch the full to enjoy the details of the fight. Why each KT Entertainment created this anime, which is available exclusively on Bilibili. The second season may take a long time to release, although this work has been completed 3 years. IRS now wage KT Entertainment is fully engaged in the production of an anime, The Three Body Problem, which will be released in the second half of the year. If you are interested in this anime, you can subscribe to this channel.